I think it was Andrew Carnegie, and I know other people like Warren Buffett have said it was actually harder to give away the money than it is to make it because it just is this like very different mindset. And right, there's a lot of like moral dimensions to it that can also feel pretty challenging.
So what's like the first step towards, because now it starts to sound overwhelming, honestly.
Yes.
So like, other than like picking a nonprofit that sounds really
Yeah.
good, like what's the first step to learning how to be a good donor, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a combination of both the head and the heart, right? So it's not wrong to start with either. And so what I often say is, what are your passions and your interests, right? That's a great place to start. What are some areas where, your personal interests or even sort of your personal story intersect with the needs of the world? And how might you get involved? So whether that's volunteering or actually writing a check, those are all great places to just get involved. And, any folks who work with donors will tell you that the change and the transformation that can happen for us doesn't actually start till that you've already made that first step. And so go ahead and do it. It doesn't have to be perfect in the beginning. It's definitely a journey that you'll embark on. And so, write that check, call that nonprofit leader up for a conversation and sort of begin that journey, meet other donors. So, yeah, my hope is that it doesn't seem overwhelming because really, as you get involved, sort of the next steps will unfold before you.
Are there pitfalls to avoid? You mentioned the kind of power dynamics that can happen that can be more hurtful than helpful. Are there
Yeah,
any other pitfalls that people commonly stumble into?
definitely. I mean, I think a couple things. One is, as I mentioned before, the problems that these nonprofits are trying to solve or the problems that you might care about are ones that are really complex and really big sometimes, right? And so we want to have the right expectation around what change we can expect to see given our resources, right? So sometimes I see donors falling into a pitfall of they write a $2,000 check and then they hound the nonprofit for some sort of attribution that, their dollars somehow moved the needle on an issue. And really, I think we just have to have humility about that the nonprofit can report out sort of their work, and that's all very fair game. Asking about how it's thinking about evaluation, how it's thinking about its impact, all fair game. But sort of tying the attribution to your gift, even for someone like Mackenzie Scott, who's given away billions of dollars, she's really only asking for a 3-page memo for the nonprofit to narrate what they think the change has been, and she's not sort of driving her own agenda there. So I think just having the sort of the right sized expectations around the size of your gift and what change you hope to see. I think the second thing really does go back to that overhead thing. I have had so many conversations with friends and donors who are just so worried about nonprofit overhead. And, sometimes what drives me nuts is like at Christmas time or around the holidays, I'll see on social media, people will post this thing about like what different nonprofit leader, executive directors' salaries are. And, someone actually only makes $10,000 and somehow that's viewed as like being the best. And I think that that is just totally the wrong mindset, right? Like, we don't ask Apple what their overhead cost is, right? Like, I think that if you want a nonprofit to be able to do its best work, it's got to be able to retain talent. It's got to have the best minds working on the work. It's got to be able to pivot when needed. So, for instance, with COVID, like in 2020, we saw nonprofits that were not working on, let's say, food distribution had to pivot because their communities didn't have any food. And so overnight, they went from, being an after school program to actually a food distribution site. And if you are a donor who's saying, I only want my funds to be spent on after school stuff, not on salaries and not on anything else that you could think of that you might need to work on, then it actually really ties the hands of nonprofits to respond. And also, again, that sustainability thing where you want them to not have to always be kind of staying up late at night worrying about like where the payroll is going to come from, right? Like you want to be able to sustain them. So I think having the right expectations and mindset around that is important too.